Hey guys, it's Kat, and I'm here today to teach you a little bit about how to make this flower eternity band within ZBrush. Now, this is a design that I've created in the past using Radial Symmetry and extract on a cylinder. So there are different ways to get this effect. One of the things I find important is that this is a flower that bends around the finger so it's comfortable. And to do that, I'm using a different technique, using something called ArrayMesh, which is over here on the right-hand side, and also another tool called Bend Arc, which I was just introduced to through Rick Powell, a new friend on Facebook. I am using my custom interface, so you'll see I have a lot of buttons down here on the bottom. If you're new with ZBrush, this makes it a lot easier to cut through all of the functions that you'll never use. So I recommend that you use the link below and the instructions to install that, so when you're following along, it's a little bit easier. I'm also using the full version of ZBrush 2018 and not Core, which is going to help us at the end when we start measuring the thickness of the band and making sure that this is completely printable. And if anybody's curious, I'm working on a Mac. However, I will give you the commands in both PC and Mac versions. I'll also tell you I've successfully cast this by printing it on a Formlabs Form 2 printer and casting it in my home studio. So this does work, it's printable and very wearable. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I have just launched ZBrush, so we'll all get the same messages. So there'll be some messages I'll tell you that you can ignore and some of them that don't tell the truth. So anyway, in launching ZBrush, the first thing I need to do is get rid of this light box, and you can do that by clicking hide up here, or you can press the comma key, which is a shortcut. So we'll start out over here with the simple brush tool, and we want a sphere 3D. And I'm starting this way so we're all on the same page. The reality is you could also use the Dynamesh sphere from the lightbox, but we'll go ahead and use sphere 3D from Simple Brush. And once we've chosen that, we'll click and drag here on the stage and immediately press the T key, as in Tom, which then activates the edit mode. A way that you can tell that you're in this edit mode is you have this little tiny white line that goes all the way around the center canvas or stage. So that's important. So once you're in that mode, you can click and drag. You can't see a lot though because you have a sphere and there's nothing sculpted, so you really can't see it. If I look over here on the right-hand side, we want to also turn on the floor grid. You can also turn that on by pressing Shift P. So go ahead and click on that. And you can see here that the floor is a little bit strange. It doesn't look like there's perspective, and that's good. You don't want perspective turned on. If you do, it looks like this. Make sure over here on the side that perspective is turned off. This will be important for when we're working with symmetry and trying to slice things. So that's set up correctly. If I look down here at the bottom, I can see that I'm missing some buttons, which for me is always a quick indicator to tell me that this is not a Polymesh 3D. So the first step before you do anything else is you need to convert this. So over on the right-hand side, about 4 rows down, there's a button that says Make Polymesh 3D. So go ahead and click that. When you do, a lot of other things will appear over here on the side, and the rest of my buttons appear. So that's always handy having this layout this way because I can tell if I've taken that important step. Now let's take a look underneath the hood and see what's happening with our sphere. If I go to the right-hand side here, I'm looking for a little grid that says Poly F at the bottom. Go ahead and click on that and take a look at your sphere. And one thing that you'll notice is that this has a lot of longitude and latitude lines, sort of like the lines on a globe. Within ZBrush though, this makes it very difficult to sculpt. So the next step is to convert this into something called a dynamesh object, which will evenly distribute that mesh across the surface. So look towards the bottom if you've got my interface, and we're looking for this dynamesh button. If you don't have that loaded yet, you'll want to, but over here on the side it's under geometry, and then you can scroll down and find dynamesh right here. But we want to accept the resolution, and the reason is because this is pretty early in the process, so I'm not really caring much about what the resolution is. So at this point, I'm just going to accept the default and click Dynamesh. And you can see that that then distributes a mesh all over the surface that's more even. So there's a lot of polygons in there. There are some triangles, but not a lot of them. But this will make it so this is sculptable. Now, the other thing I want to do is to click and drag on the background and press the Shift key, which will lock in on a top view, which will be important here in a minute when we start making the flower. Now we don't need to see the mesh anymore, so we can turn it off by clicking the polyframe button or pressing Shift F. So now we're ready to start sculpting. So I want to turn on Radial Symmetry, and I can do that here under the Transform menu, or I also have it in my interface sort of. So you can toggle symmetry on and off by pressing the X key. So you can do that, or just go to Transform, look at Activate Symmetry, and I know because of the orientation of our sphere that I want symmetry about the Y-axis. I need to turn off X, and I also want to turn on Radial Symmetry. In my interface and with my hotkeys, I can kind of toggle these on and off by pressing 4, 5, 6, and 7. 7 is radial. So once you get used to this, know that there's some shortcuts for that as well. Now, as I run my cursor over the sphere, you can see that there's little tiny dots situated all the way around. And I did choose a radial count of 8. So you can see here, radial count of 8. You could also adjust that to be 5 or 6 or whatever else you want it to be. Now, the tool we're going to use today is one that I just recently became familiar with, and it's called Snake Hook. So click over here under the brush palette over here and look for Snake Hook, which is down here somewhere in the bottom. The other thing you can do is you can use a shortcut, which is to type the letter B, then S and H. So B is in boy, S is in Sam, H is in holiday, I guess. And that will also load the Snake Hook brush. You will also want this brush to be a little larger, so we can press the space bar and then increase the draw size to maybe something like 200. Now, as I zoom in, and just for a quick refresher, to zoom in, you're going to press the Option or Alt key, so Option on a Mac, Alt on a PC, and hold it. Then click on the background with your mouse, then release the key, and then you can zoom in and out. So if you're not familiar with navigation, you might also want to go back to the ZBrush Core site, and it has some really good tutorials on navigation. But we'll assume everybody's on the same page here. So we'll zoom in a little bit, and then I'm going to click and just sort of start dragging out petals on my flower. You will see that this is not really pretty. So there's a lot of faceting here, and that looks really ugly. So why don't we take a look at the underlying mesh again? So we'll click on Polyframe or press Shift F and see what's happening here. In fact, I can see some of this, some of those polygons actually disappear. So whenever you've done a lot of distortion on a ZBrush model, you want to re-dynamesh, assuming it's already a dynamesh object. You can click this button twice, so click dynamesh once, then twice, or hold down Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, and then draw a box on the background, and it will redistribute that mesh. And every time we do a good amount of sculpting, then we want to re-dynamesh again. Now I can turn off the polyframe, and it still looks really bad. So if you're in my interface, there's one thing you can do that's quick. You can use the Polish Crisp Edges. You want to click on this dot right here, and I could maybe polish it the number 2. And another thing I could do is I could use the Shift key and then click and drag to smooth that out. So that's nice and smooth now. Then we can use our brush to make some more changes. So I just want to drag this out a little bit more. And if I want, before it starts getting ugly again, I can re-dynamesh. Hold down Command or Control and draw the box. Use your Shift key and smooth it out if you want, and then drag it out a little bit more. So it's just a process of doing this several times until you get a petal shape that you like. Another thing is if you want these petals to overlap a little bit more, I can also mask off one side. So I can hold down Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, and then be sure and click on the object. And that will bring in a mask like that, where you can then drag your petals over and get it closer to the other one, like that. Then I can use Command or Control, click and drag a box on the background, and maybe just click. No, clicking on the background reverses the mask. So we'll hold down Command or Control, draw a box, and then we do that one more time to re-dynamesh. Now I can use my Shift key again to smooth this all out and make it look pretty, and there I have a nice flower. So I can go in and do some sculpting, but we're going to clean it up a little bit first. Let's turn to the side, so click and drag, and then press the Shift key to lock in on a side view. Now we'll switch to the Move mode, either by clicking on the icon or pressing W, and you'll see that it gives you this Gizmo 3D. If you don't have the gizmo, be sure and click this button up here or press Y. Now hold down Command or Control and click up. I did it wrong. I actually clicked on the line instead, so I'll undo. Hold down Command or Control and then click on this green box and then drag up. And this is a shortcut for using the clip command, which there is a clip command that you can find up here under the brush menu, I guess. But you can use the gizmo to do it very quickly and easily. If I click and drag to the bottom, you can see that it cut off the bottom, but it also closed it at the same time. And so that looks good. Again, I click and drag and use the Shift key to get to a side view. And now do the same thing. Hold down Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, click and drag on that little green box, and drag this down so it's even on the top. So we now have a flat flower that looks something like that. And that looks good. I can then switch back to the draw mode and use the Shift key to smooth this and do the same on the bottom. So it's just making it neat. We'll eventually be cutting that off, so it won't matter for right now. Now we can go to the top, so let's zoom in on the top and get a good view. And I'm going to switch to a different brush. I want to switch to the Clay Buildup tool, which is up here in the Quick Picks. And maybe zoom in on one of these petals, and I want to carve this out. So let's get a smaller brush. I'll press the space bar and reduce the draw size to maybe something like 90 or 100. Now I can just start sculpting, although I'll pause for a moment because I just put a lot of material on. Let me undo, and I can adjust the intensity up here at the top, or it's also located under the same place when we press the space bar. The intensity is right here. I would take that down to maybe 5 or 6 because it deposits less material and it's a lot easier to smooth out. So I'm just going to enhance the edge here, sort of build this up, to smooth that out. And then you can maybe bring this into the center. Sort of build it up. And I'll show you another trick. Something that I always do when I'm making jewelry is I like to zoom out and see what this looks like from afar, and I'll show you why. So once I smooth that out, I zoom all the way out till this is about actual size. And I started doing this after a lot of unsuccessful prints and unsuccessful jewelry. So I've learned that when I'm working on it big, I think it looks one way, but then when it's actually printed small, it looks different. So looking at this, I can see that those edges aren't really visible. So I might want to pump them up just a little bit. So I'm just going to add more material, make them a little thicker. I can smooth that out. I can also use the Option or Alt key to sort of carve away a bit. Sort of sculpt this a little. And then the Shift key will smooth it. And if you play with this, you can also kind of get some nice streaks that sort of look like flower petals. That's another thing I've done. Maybe make it a little bit more realistic. So as you zoom out, see if those are even visible. You can also change materials. So over here on the side, I have a Ma Dirty Blue or MAH Dirty Blue. You can switch it to that, and that sometimes makes it a little more visible when you move out like that. Now the reality is that the low parts of this, if I'm going to darken this with a patina, you won't actually, you won't see any of those streaks unless they're fairly prominent. So just get a flower that's appealing to you, and if you want, you could hit pause for a moment while you work on your flower and then come back. So assuming that you're continuing on, let's go ahead and flatten this middle part real quick. And I'm going to start sketching in a center of my flower. And this can be something that is just flat, or it could have a ridge on it, sort of like a sunflower. And I do another version of this where I actually dig out a hole and then use that as a starter to set a stone later on. So you could drill that out later and set a stone. So let's just say I'll leave mine like that, but you know, be sure and kind of bump this up. I want a nice edge though between the flower, so that needs to be a fairly vertical edge. You can see it has sort of flat sides on it, and if you want to fix that, you could also go down to your radial count and pump that up a little bit. I just bumped it up to 37, and that will make it a lot smoother. So let's say if I wanted to do that as a flush set stone, for example, I could do this. And there's my flower. All right, so now that you have a flower and a center, now we're ready to start working on the next part of this tutorial, which is to repeat the pattern. So I am going to turn off Radial Symmetry by pressing X, or you can go up to the Transform menu. And let's talk about how to duplicate this. We're going to be using a function called ArrayMesh. So it's going to be over here on the right. But before we do that, let's see if we can bump down this resolution a little bit, because the higher the resolution or number of active points on this flower, the longer it takes to create the ArrayMesh. So let's see if we can play with this a little bit. I'm going to go down to the Dynamesh box at the bottom and look at the resolution, and I'm going to bump this down quite a bit. Let's put in something low like 32 and then re-Dynamesh. So hold down Command or Control and re-Dynamesh and see what happens. And I did this one really low on purpose to make a point. So you can see that this low resolution is not good. So we'll undo and let's try something else. We were at 128, so let's jump up to 60. It automatically updates that to 64, and then let's re-Dynamesh and see. And this is still a little bit rough and it's doing something weird with the petals. So I'll undo. And then let's maybe go up a little bit more. Let me go to 96 and then re-Dynamesh and see how it did. And the difference here is that it is a little bit pixelated, but not bad. My active points are now, it went from 140,000 something to 63. So that just means that when we do our array, it will be a lot faster. Also, if we zoom out, you can't tell. The resolution is lower, but once this is printed, it won't make a difference. So there we go. Now let's go over and work on the ArrayMesh. Now in the past, if I were doing a ring like this, I might use something called a radial array. And there is a preset under the light box for a radial array. The problem is that your ring ends up then not being, it's kind of flat. It's not nicely curved around the ring. So that's why I don't want to use that. You can hide this or press the comma key to get rid of it. Oh, and I do remember one other thing we need to do, a little bit of maintenance here. So the other thing is I need to turn this to the side, press click and drag, and then press the Shift key. Hold down Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, and start anywhere out here down at the bottom. And I need to draw a mask that comes up right here where this starts to curve. I need to double check the top and make sure that it hasn't masked off anything else, and it hasn't. Now I need to reverse the mask. And to do that, hold down Command or Control and click once on the background like that. I can also soften this mask a little bit by pressing Command or Control and clicking once on the flower, not on the background, but on the flower, and you can see that blurred the mask a little bit. And that might make for nicer sides. Now we switch to the Move mode and use this green arrow to pull this down, and that thickens our flower. So we want to make it look something like that. Now to clear the mask, hold down Command or Control, draw a box on the background, and remember anytime we stretch something we need to re-dynamesh it. If you want to see why, click on the polyframe button and you can see that we've distorted those polygons. So let's re-dynamesh by holding Command or Control and drawing a box on the background, and you can see it distributed the mesh nicely. If we turn off the polyframe though, it still looks kind of chunky and awful. So let's switch to the draw mode and then use our cursor. Oh, we also need symmetry turned on. So let's go back to transform, activate symmetry, and we need to make sure that that radial count is 8. So type 8 and hit enter. And then you can use your shift key to blend this in. Make it nice and smooth. Something like that. All right, so that gives us a flower, and it's a nice thick flower because once we're done with this, we'll need to resize it, so we want more material than less. All right, now to go back over to the lightbox, the ArrayMesh, we want to click on the button that says ArrayMesh, and now we want to repeat right here, type in 11 and hit enter. Now this is going to be the number of flowers on your ring plus 1 because we're going to actually chop the ends off. So I have 11 here, but nothing seems to have happened. Now if I go down here to the X amount slider, I can then click and drag this. Although I'm going to go a different direction, and this depends on what direction I was at. So let me undo. I had to click on the background and then undo. And let me try, it's not Y, it would be the Z axis. So I want it to go over to the side like this. And in a moment, we're going to rotate this flower. So we'll make some adjustments back and forth, but we want it to be something like this, where it's overlapped. Now I can tell that symmetry is still on, so let's turn it off because it might give unexpected results. And then let's switch to the move mode. And by doing that, we can then rotate our flower in a way so the petals are oriented nicely. But now it's not pretty. So let's increase the size just a little bit. And I think that's good. So what we're looking for is we want these petals right here to be touching. In fact, they could be further away. You can rotate this if you want a bit. But what we're looking for is these petals to be touching, and then these are going to overlap. So let's even go a little bit further. So that's too far, obviously, but just kind of bring it together. And I can't, oh, there it is. Okay, I brought it together. Mine's at about 7.6. And the way that this is overlapped with these other two petals is just fine. So we're going to be angling this in just a moment to make these come in front of the other one. Now we need to recenter this axis. So you'll hold down Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC, which unlocks our axis, and then click on this round arrow, which then reorients the axis so it's straight up and down. Now we'll click on the background and drag, and hold the Shift key, and use this little circle here to rotate the flower just enough so that the petal sticks out on the front like this. And that looks good. So we just want it to be raised up enough that it's going to show up when it prints. And so I think that that works just fine. Now, if you need to make any other adjustments, like I might want to take this a little bit further, I might go in and actually type the number, maybe 7.7, and hit enter. And that was the wrong direction. So I'll click again and do 7.45 and hit enter. And that brought these together so there's not a hole. There will be a hole right here between the flowers, but this other one is nice and closed. So there we go. There is our flower band. Now I need to reset this axis one more time, so I'll hold down Option or Alt and then click on the round arrow again, and that centers it. And that won't matter here shortly, but that's what we need. Now the last step is to go in and convert this to a mesh. Now what happens within ZBrush, if I click on this polyframe, you can see that ZBrush sees this as a meshed object. These other ones are just repeated instances of that. which means that my active points are very low because ZBrush thinks this is the only one that's sculptable. However, to go in and make changes to the other ones, I need to convert it to a mesh. So within the ArrayMesh section, I need to click Make Mesh. And it will take a little bit of time to do it. Actually, that was pretty quick, but it's usually, it's going to jump up over 1 million points. So you can see it went from 94,000 to 1 million. If this had been, say, 150,000, it would have taken a lot longer. So now I can zoom out and see that this is now all one mesh. So I can turn this polyframe off and we'll go to the next step. So now we need to find the center of this. So let's go ahead and use this third icon up here on the gizmo to find the center. And then we need to use the home button, I guess the little home icon, will center it within our universe. So let's click on that. So it's now centered here on our grid, so it means it's centered. And then I need to reset the gizmo one more time. So we'll use Option or Alt, click on that, and that just makes sure that this is lined up correctly. That looks pretty good. Now we need to cut off the back because the back, as you can see, is kind of weird. So let's cut that off, and we're going to use that same clipping function in the gizmo to do that. Hold down Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, and click and drag this little green part until it looks something like this. And that gives us a nice flat back of the ring. So that looks good. All right, so the next step is to cut off the ends. So let's go ahead and close up the ArrayMesh section because we don't need it anymore. And we are going to the Subtool palette and we will be appending a cube. So use the Append button and append a cube 3D, which is here in the middle. Let's go ahead and turn on transparency though, because this will make it easier to tell that the flower band is active and we need to make this little cube active. So let's click on it. And now it also gives us the silhouette of the flowers, which will make this easier. We need to increase the size of the cube, so click on this yellow box and drag that until it is bigger than the flowers. And then we'll move it over using the blue arrow to this side over here. And what I'm looking for is just some sort of reference point. So say, for example, I could try and use maybe the center. I could use the center of the flower could be my reference point. Or it could be that I'm looking at the edge of a petal, although that sometimes creates more cleanup. So I'm going to go for about the middle of this little circle here in the middle or the center of the flower. Now I can zoom out. I need to duplicate this box. So I'll hold down Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, and click and drag a copy over to the other side. Now I'll zoom in and then use the blue arrow to move this to the center of my flower. And you just want to make sure that it's kind of in the same place as the other side. And the reason I was able to move this one without the other one is because this one's masked. So the next step is to release the mask by holding down Command or Control, draw a box on the background, and now both of these are unmasked. So we'll be subtracting this. So we're doing the next operation as a dynamesh boolean operation. So what that means is our cubes now will be subtracted. So we need to click this third icon right here that's a moon, and that tells ZBrush we're going to subtract it. We need to make sure that our flower band is above those. If it's not, you can use these arrows down here to move it up and down. But it needs to be above the other layer. And we also need to know that this is a Dynamesh object. So remember I said when I load my interface, I like having the Dynamesh button visible because at a glance I can tell you this is ready. Now we select and make sure that the band is active. We can see it's blue here and it's grayed out up here. We're going to merge down, which is down here below in this subtool palette. So we'll use merge down, or if you're in my interface, the merge down button is right here. So click that, and it's going to tell you this is not undoable. Anyway, it's a lie, it is. So you can click always OK, but you can actually undo that operation. Just click OK. These are now merged together. It didn't subtract them, which is a little deceptive. But the last step on this is to go ahead and re-dynamesh. So remember, we hold down Command or Control, click and drag on the background, and that will perform another dynamesh operation, and it will subtract these cubes. Now we have a band that should be continuous. If we were to wrap this around, the edges will meet. So that is everything that we need to do to prepare the ring for bending. So the next step is to go over here to this little gear right here and choose Bend Arc. When we do that, we get a totally different interface item that we probably haven't seen. But we need to click and drag to the side of this, and remember which side your design is on. Click and drag and use the Shift key to look directly at a side, move it down here to the bottom, and then click and drag this little green cone until it stops moving. So you'll see it stop. We can't see it at the top, but we know when it stops moving, it's wrapped it all the way around. And you can see if you go to the top that should be pretty close, but enough that we can blend it later. And now the last step is to use the white cone. If you go to the right, it will increase the size, but if you go to the left, it decreases. And we need to make this so it's kind of thick, like we had intended, and then turn and move it to the side. What you'll see is that the flower's probably not proportional. So like the center is a good indicator of that. It's not round. So you can use the little white cone here to try and make it so that flower center is nice and round. And just make sure that it looks like what you want it to look like. Okay, so that looks good. It's not squashed, because before we had squashed it like that, but we want it to come back and be round. And when we do that, we are almost ready for the next operation. And I can tell you I'm using a Wacom pad, so when I'm trying to do that with my pen, it's hard. So I just switched over to my mouse to get that correct. Now there's one last step on this, which is look for the little gear, click on that, and we need to accept the Bend Arc operation. And when we do that, this is now a rounded piece. It still has not merged this totally, so these ends are close, but it's not merged. So the way we do that is we re-dynamesh. Hold down Command or Control and draw a box on the background and watch what happens. So it blended that in pretty nicely. You can switch to the draw mode and then hold the Shift key and sort of give that a little bit of a blend. Try and keep your design intact and don't forget to come to the side. The back won't matter because we're about to cut that off. So just make sure that everything looks pretty good. And remember, if you're turning, you need to click on the background like that. And there we have our flowers. So there's my little flower ring. So last but not least is the part where we actually make this actual size. And let me see if I can bring this up real quick, but I usually use the ring size Wiki. Let's see if I can bring that up. There we go. Go to Wikipedia. And there's a good article in there that shows you everything that you need to know. So I can scroll down and say, well, I need a US size 7. And so what I'm looking for right here is this here, which tells me that a size 7 is about 17.32 millimeters in diameter. It also has it in inches if you don't like millimeters, but I think most jewelers like to use millimeters. So that's our target, is we know that the middle of this ring is going to be about 17.32. We'll probably bump that up with about 0.5 millimeter just to adjust for shrinkage and stuff, but here we go. So the best way I know to do this is to go ahead and append a cylinder. Now the cylinder is going to give us a size that is, I guess, accurate, and then we can resize the ring around it. The other thing I noticed when I brought that cylinder in is ZBrush brings that in the middle of our little universe. Well, the ring is not centered. So I'll select the ring real quickly, switch to the move mode. I'll use this centering icon, this third one, and then click on the house, which will bring it to the center. Now you can see it's lined up with this cylinder. I'll switch back to the cylinder and then zoom in, and I want to turn to a side view where I can see that this cylinder is on its side like that. Now I can click and drag and use the Shift key to lock in at 90 degrees. I also noticed that this particular cylinder is not smooth, so I need to smooth that out. And the way I do that is using the divide command. So here under the geometry palette, there's divide, or you can use Command or Control D, and I usually do that 2 or 3 times. So I'll divide, 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 and then I'll delete the lower levels. It usually gives me a cylinder, a smooth one is about 31,000 points. Now there is one other little maintenance thing that I do, which is to chop the ends of this cylinder off, because when we resize it, because one edge is rounded and all this, anyway, it doesn't end up to be the right size. So I'll usually use the Command or Control, click on this little box and just make that a sharp edge. I'm just gonna do it to the bottom. It doesn't have to be perfect or pretty, just needs to be sharp edges. Now I can go into the size command, which is at the bottom of the geometry palette. So we're gonna be using XYZ size, or in my interface, it's down here at the bottom. And remember that we were going to add about a 0.5 millimeter to that. So I'm going to type in 17.8 and hit return. And it resizes that cylinder to be 17.8 millimeters in effect. Now, because it's filled my whole screen here, I need to click somewhere. If I look at this size, it's red, which means it's waiting for me to type something else. So by clicking here somewhere in the middle, it deselects that. And then I can press the F key as in Frank, which fills the screen with the cylinder. Now the trick here is with the XYZ command, when I just changed this one number, well, the X size, which is actually the shortest size, it's top to bottom, is 14.4 millimeters, but the other 2 critical sizes are 17.8. It is a little confused, so if you look at the axis ball, it's not oriented correctly, and I'll show you how to fix that. Click and hold or press down on Option Alt and then reset this little ball arrow thing. You can see now it's reset the axis to be correct. So the red one is the X axis, and then that is the one that's 14.4. But again, the critical diameter here is 17.8, and that is correct. Now switch over to the subtool palette again, and we're going to click on the ring. Now click and drag. So this is you're looking at a side view, and we want to increase the size of the ring. So we're just going to use this little yellow square here and make this so it sticks out a bit from the ring, like that. I can also rotate it a bit because I'm looking for the thickest part of the ring, or not thickest, but maybe the thinner part instead of this thick part here. So I am going to rotate it just a bit so I can see maybe this part of the ring is right here. And then again, I'm going to reset this axis. So I'll hold down Option or Alt and then click on the round arrow again. So now that's situated correctly. Now I'm going to use something called the transpose line. So the old method of the move command in ZBrush was using a transpose line. The gizmo is actually fairly new. So we want to turn off the gizmo, and that gives us this little line. And that line is going to be used as a measuring device. We want to switch to the cylinder, so I can use a shortcut, which is Option or Alt, and click on the cylinder, and that will make it active. Then I'm going to click on the background and drag to the side, and I want to place my little transpose line somewhere along this axis here, where it was, but let's move it out here. So I just click once, and then click and drag to the side, and what you'll see is this little transpose line here is now a measuring tool. If I zoom in a bit, I should have some little lines. I do. And so you can just count the lines, but this main line right here is now 1 millimeter. So the thickness of our ring, probably an average, is about 1.1 millimeters. I need that to be thicker. So I'm going for maybe about 1.4 to 1.5 millimeters. Let's leave this little line here though. Let's switch and make this ring active. So you'll hold down Option or Alt and click on it. It's now active. Now we can use the size command to increase its size while being situated around the center axis. So I'll zoom in so I can watch this scale over here. If you don't have my interface, you can find the size command down here under deformation. Size is right here. Or you can use mine that's down here at the bottom. And all I want to do is I want to increase the size of this ring until I can count. So there's 1.1, 2, 3, 4. So that's a 1.4 millimeter thickness, which is pretty good. I could go a little bit bigger if I want. So maybe I just bump it up 1, so I could type the number 1 there. And when I do, it's a little bit bigger, but let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's now 1.5 millimeters thick. And so we'll just go with it for there. That's a little bit thicker band, but it will also be very durable. So let's zoom out. And I also want to make sure though that my ring overlaps this shaded circle right here. And if yours doesn't, you might have to go in and do another operation. Just, I'd say roll with it for now, but you'll want to decrease the size of your ring until you have a little bit of overlap here. Now zoom out, and what we're ready to do is to do a boolean operation. Okay, so we're going to be subtracting the circle from the ring. So I go to the subtool palette. I need to make sure that the cylinder is beneath the ring, which it is. Click on the little subtract icon. Click on the ring and make sure that it's active. And now we're just going to merge down and then redynamesh. So go down here into the subtool palette and look for merge down, or in my interface it's right here. So we'll merge those. It looks like it added them together. Now we redynamesh, hold down Command or Control and drag a box on the background. And once it redynameshes, and it's going to do something we didn't want it to do, and I'll show you what's going to happen. Quickly, look at the active points, which is 670,000. I didn't adjust my Dynamesh resolution, and so this bumps it up to a very high resolution. So let's undo real quick. Remember it said that you can't undo this operation. It's not true. Let's undo and get back to this point where these are merged into one subtool, but we have not yet dynameshed. And let's bump this down. Let's take it to something like maybe 60, which of course will bump up to 64. And now let's redynamesh. So redynamesh, and it'll be a higher resolution, but it's not going to be 200,000 or 2 million. So it's still 1.1 million, which is a little bit high if you were sending it out to Shapeways. But that's a nice thick ring like that. But let's say we did want to send it to Shapeways. We know our thickness is right, everything's good, and we needed to get that size down just a bit. So we could go into the Z plugin right here and look for something called Decimation Master. And with Decimation Master, I can tell it to pre-process the current subtool. So we'll click on that. And I'd say just accept the default values. It'll take a moment to think about it. And another moment to think about it. Now I could go get a drink. Okay, it's going to write it to disk. Watch up here. And once that's done, we can go back to Z plugin and do the second step, which is to decimate the current. Now you can see that it's bumped the size down to 231,000, which will be sufficient for sending it out to someplace like Shapeways. So I guess another thing you could take a look at, these edges right here are a little bit sharp. So if you wanted to go back in and smooth those out, you could go into the Transform menu and activate Symmetry. And remember that we had a count of 11, but we cut one off. So let's type 10. That's our radial count. And that's obviously not right. So you can see that. We switch to the draw mode also. So that's not the right symmetry. So let's try our shortcuts. If you've loaded my hotkeys, I can press 4 to turn on X and then turn off Y by pressing 5. And now you can see that I've got radial symmetry. Now all I have to do is to go in, maybe increase my brush size a little bit by pressing the space bar, and then use the Shift key. Oh, and see what it's doing? That's because we decimated already. If you need to smooth it out, you can redynamesh. If you do, it'll bump the size back up. But anyway, I would probably go in and smooth these edges before you do the decimation, but you get the idea. You could smooth that out. And so there is our flower ring that's ready to take to a service to print or to print to your 3D printer. I can tell you that putting the supports on this becomes a little challenging. If you were able to see it, you can look at these low edges right here. If you're sending it to Shapeways, they take care of it, but on your own printer, you would have to add supports to any low spot like this. So when I printed this one, it did have quite a few supports, but it wasn't that hard to do, and it turned out really well. So this is a nice ring that I actually wear as a wedding band now. For the final, I guess, ta-da moment, you could also switch it to a shiny material and see what your ring is going to look like, or maybe even shiny dirty. And that looks kind of like it has a patina. So anyway, that is a fairly complex tutorial to make an eternity band, but you can use this technique for just about anything. It could be flowers, it could be cars, it could be anything. So hopefully you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions at all, leave me a message down below in the comments. And as always, happy ZBrushing.